June 17th, 1930. The White House, Washington, D.C. President Herbert Hoover sits at his desk with a pen about to sign a bill that 1,028 economists have publicly begged him to veto. They took out newspaper advertisements. They wrote him letters. Henry Ford personally called it an economic stupidity. The most respected economic minds in America are, almost unanimously, warning him that this single signature could turn a recession into a catastrophe. Hoover signs it anyway. The bill is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. It raises tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to some of the highest levels in American history. The logic is simple and emotionally satisfying. Protect American jobs, punish foreign competitors, bring industry home. What happens next becomes one of the most studied economic episodes of the 20th century. Within 2 years, other nations retaliate. Canada, France, Britain, dozens more, raising their own tariffs against American goods. Global trade collapses by roughly 2/3. American exports fall off a cliff. The recession that was already underway deepens into the Great Depression. Unemployment climbs toward 25%. I've spent months studying exactly how this happened. The mechanism, the sequence, the way a policy designed to protect an economy became entangled with its collapse. And here is why I could not stop thinking about it, because in 2025, America launched the most aggressive tariff expansion since Smoot-Hawley itself. And in February 2026, the Supreme Court struck down the largest part of it, throwing the entire system into a legal situation that remains unresolved as I record this. I want to be clear about something before we go further. This is not a video about whether tariffs are good or bad. It is not about any political party or any president. It is about a mechanism, a specific economic sequence that has repeated across very different governments and very different centuries. I am going to show you the history as accurately as I can and the present as accurately as I can, and then you are going to draw your own conclusions. That is the entire point of this channel. Stay with me. Here is what most people get wrong about Smoot-Hawley. The popular story is that it single-handedly caused the Great Depression. That one tariff bill sank the global economy. And that version is too simple. Economists still debate exactly how much of the Depression's severity Smoot-Hawley is responsible for. The stock market had already crashed in October 1929, 8 months before the bill was signed. Banking failures, monetary policy mistakes, and structural weaknesses all played enormous roles. So let me be precise, because precision is the whole point here. Smoot-Hawley did not by itself cause the Great Depression. What it did was something more specific and, in a way, more instructive. It took a serious but potentially manageable downturn and added a mechanism that made recovery dramatically harder by triggering a chain of international retaliation that shrank the total amount of trade in the world. And that mechanism, the retaliation spiral, is the thing worth understanding. Because unlike the specific monetary conditions of 1930, the retaliation spiral is not a relic. It is a permanent feature of how trade conflicts work. It ran in 1930. And the conditions for it exist again now. But first, let me make sure we are talking about the same thing. Because tariff is one of those words everyone uses and few people define precisely. A tariff is simply a tax on imported goods. When a product crosses the border into a country, the importing business pays a percentage of its value to the government. That is the entire mechanism at the most basic level, a tax collected at the border. Now here is the part that generates most of the confusion and most of the political heat. Who actually pays that tax? The intuitive answer, the one that makes tariffs politically appealing, is that the foreign country pays it. You are taxing their goods, so you are punishing them, so they bear the cost. But the economics are more complicated. The tax is legally paid by the domestic company doing the importing, not by the foreign exporter. And that domestic importer generally passes at least some of the cost on to its own customers, ordinary people and businesses in the tariff-imposing country, in the form of higher prices. How much of the cost falls on foreign exporters versus domestic consumers is genuinely debated, and it varies enormously by product and situation. But the crucial point, the one that history keeps teaching, is that a tariff is not a clean weapon that only strikes the other side. It is a tax that ripples through your own economy too. And understanding that is the key to understanding why the story of 1930 unfolded the way it did. Let me show you exactly how it worked. By 1930, American agriculture was already in deep trouble. Throughout the 1920s, while the cities boomed, American farmers had struggled with overproduction and falling prices. There was genuine, real economic pain in rural America, and there was a genuine, understandable political demand to do something about it. This is important, and I want to sit on it for a moment. Smoot-Hawley did not come from nowhere. It came from real suffering and a real desire to protect people who were genuinely hurting. The impulse behind it was not stupid or evil. It was the completely human impulse to protect your own people from forces that feel beyond their control. Almost every tariff in history is born from that same understandable impulse. Keep that in mind, because it is exactly why this mechanism is so durable. It grows from something reasonable. The original bill was meant to help farmers, but once it began moving through Congress, something happened that anyone who has watched legislation will recognize. Every industry wanted its own protection. If farmers were getting tariffs, why not manufacturers? Why not textiles? Why not steel? Why not chemicals? Why not hundreds of other products? Lobbyists filled the halls of Congress. Each representative fought to get protection for the industries in their own district. The bill ballooned far beyond its original purpose. What started as targeted agricultural relief became a sweeping wall of tariffs across more than 20,000 categories of goods. One of the broadest tariff increases in the nation's history. This process has a lesson embedded in it. Protectionism, once it starts, is very hard to contain. It begins with a genuine, specific grievance, struggling farmers. But the political logic of protection for me, too, is nearly unstoppable. Every industry can make its own reasonable-sounding case. And so a narrow measure becomes a broad one, almost automatically, through the ordinary machinery of politics. The scope of Smoot-Hawley was not really a decision anyone made on purpose. It was the emergent result of many separate reasonable-sounding demands, each piling onto the last. There is something worth pausing on here. Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon, the two men whose names are now permanently attached to one of history's cautionary tales, were not reckless men. They believed sincerely that they were protecting American workers and American industry. Smoot, in particular, was a serious, respected legislator. Neither man intended to worsen a global depression. They are remembered the way they are remembered because of what the mechanism did with their intentions, not because of some obvious villainy anyone could have seen at the time. In fact, the bill was popular in many quarters when it passed. The catastrophe was visible only in hindsight. Now here's the critical part, the mechanism that turns a domestic policy into an international disaster. A tariff is not a private decision. When America raised its tariffs, it did not simply adjust an internal dial. It changed the terms of trade for every country that sold goods to America. And those countries had their own farmers, their own manufacturers, their own struggling workers, their own political pressures. From their perspective, America had just fired the first shot, so they fired back. Canada, America's largest trading partner, retaliated with its own tariffs and deliberately redirected its trade toward Britain and away from the United States. This was not a minor adjustment. Canada shifted the entire orientation of its economy, strengthening ties within the British Empire through a system of preferential trade that deliberately excluded American goods. A market that had been oriented toward the United States turned, in part, away from it, and some of that reorientation proved lasting. France and Italy imposed countermeasures. Spain passed retaliatory tariffs. Switzerland organized a boycott of American products. Dozens of nations raised barriers against American goods, each responding to its own domestic industries demanding protection from the new American walls. And crucially, many of these countries were also each other's trading partners. So the retaliation did not just run between America and everyone else. It rippled sideways, country against country, as each government scrambled to protect itself in a world that was suddenly raising walls everywhere at once. A wave of retaliation and counter-retaliation swept through the entire global economy, feeding on itself. And here is the devastating result. When everyone raises walls against everyone else, the total amount of trade in the world does not simply redistribute, it shrinks. Between 1929 and 1934, the total value of world trade fell by roughly 2/3. This was not a case of trade moving from one country to another. It was trade disappearing, transactions that simply never happened, goods that were never made, jobs that were never created on all sides of every border. The tariff was designed to protect American jobs, but American factories needed to export too. When global trade collapsed, American exporters lost their foreign markets. Farmers, the people the bill was originally meant to help, found their overseas customers gone because those customers' economies were now shrinking and their governments had retaliated against American agricultural goods specifically. The policy meant to help farmers ended up deepening their pain. Consider the bitter irony in concrete terms. An American wheat farmer in 1931 faced a world where European countries, retaliating against American tariffs, had raised barriers specifically against American crops. The foreign buyers who had purchased his surplus were now buying from Canada, from Argentina, from Australia, countries that had not triggered the same retaliation. The tariff that was sold to him as protection had helped wall him out of the very markets he depended on. he got the protection he was promised on the goods he bought and lost the customers he needed for the goods he sold. On net, for many farmers, it was a catastrophe wearing the costume of help. This is the single most important thing to understand about the mechanism, and it is why it deserves such careful study. The harm does not announce itself as harm. It arrives dressed as protection. It is championed by people who genuinely mean well, supported by people who are genuinely suffering, and its costs land later, elsewhere, on people who often cannot trace them back to the original decision. A policy can be simultaneously well-intentioned, popular, and destructive. Those things are not contradictions. In the case of Smoot-Hawley, they were all true at once. This is the trap at the center of every trade war. Each individual step is defensible from the perspective of the country taking it. Protecting your own industry is reasonable. Responding when someone taxes your goods is reasonable. But the sum of all these individually reasonable decisions is a world with dramatically less trade, less production, and less prosperity for everyone involved. It is a machine that runs on reasonable intentions and produces collective damage. Economists have a name for this kind of situation. It is a version of what game theorists call a collective action problem, or sometimes a prisoner's dilemma. Each player, acting rationally to protect its own interests, produces an outcome that is worse for everyone, including itself, than if all players had cooperated. The tragedy of the trade war is not that anyone is behaving irrationally. It is that everyone is behaving rationally. And rationality itself, in this specific structure, leads off a cliff. No single country can afford to unilaterally lower its walls while others keep theirs up. So the walls stay up or rise higher, even as everyone privately understands that the collective result is destructive. This is why trade wars are so difficult to stop once they begin. It is not a failure of intelligence, it is a structural trap. Understanding this is the difference between blaming individuals and understanding a mechanism, and only one of those actually helps you see what is coming. Now, here is the United States and the world right now. And I am going to walk through the facts as carefully as I can, because this is where accuracy matters most. Beginning in early 2025, the American government launched a sweeping expansion of tariffs. In April 2025, in an event the administration called Liberation Day, broad tariffs were announced on goods from more than 80 countries using emergency economic powers. Rates varied widely by country. Additional tariffs were placed on specific commodities: steel, aluminum, copper, automobiles, semiconductors, and more, sell under separate legal authorities. By 2026, according to nonpartisan analyses, the average effective tariff rate on American imports had risen to roughly 11%, the highest level in nearly a century. Not since the era of Smoot-Hawley had American tariffs sat this high on average. Let that comparison land for a moment. The very policy we are studying from 1930 is the historical benchmark that current tariff levels are now being measured against. When analysts reach for a comparison, Smoot-Hawley is the reference point they use, not as a loose metaphor, but as the actual last time the numbers looked like this. Multiple nonpartisan research organizations estimated that these tariffs would cost the average American household somewhere in the range of $1,000 to $1,400 per year if made permanent, because, as we discussed, a significant share of tariff costs tends to pass through to domestic consumers as higher prices. Supporters dispute these estimates and point to other potential benefits. Critics emphasize them. I am giving you the figures from nonpartisan sources and letting you weigh them yourself. Then came a major turning point. In February 2026, the Supreme Court ruled that the emergency powers used for the largest portion of these tariffs, the broad country-by-country tariffs, were not authorized by law. In a 6-3 decision, those specific tariffs were invalidated. The same day, the administration responded by imposing a new across-the-board tariff of around 10% under a different legal authority, one that carries a built-in time limit set to expire in mid-2026 unless extended. Meanwhile, the commodity-specific tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and other goods imposed under yet another legal authority remained fully in place. I am giving you these specifics not to bury you in detail, but because the detail reveals something important. The current situation is defined by extraordinary uncertainty. Layers of tariffs imposed under different laws, some struck down, some replaced, some temporary, some permanent, some under active legal challenge. For businesses trying to plan, for other countries trying to respond, the picture keeps shifting. And that uncertainty itself is part of the mechanism. Here is the critical part. the place where the 1930 parallel becomes precise, and also the place where it genuinely differs. The core Smoot-Hawley mechanism, retaliation, is present now. Trading partners have not simply absorbed American tariffs quietly. Countries and blocs have negotiated, retaliated, and in some cases redirected their trade relationships. The European Union, China, Canada, and others have each responded in their own ways, through counter-tariffs, through trade deals with terms of their own, and through deepening trade relationships that root around the United States. Look closely and you can see the 1930 pattern trying to repeat. Just as Canada in 1930 redirected its trade toward Britain and away from America, some countries today are deepening trade ties with each other specifically to reduce their dependence on the American market. When one large economy becomes an unpredictable trading partner, the rational response of everyone else is to build alternatives, new agreements, new supply chains, new relationships that route around the uncertainty. Each of these individual decisions is sensible, but collectively they can gradually erode the central role America has held in global trade for 80 years. This is the same sideways rippling that turned a bilateral dispute into a global contraction in 1930, reappearing in slower and more modern form today. This is the retaliation spiral in a modern form, not identical to 1930, but recognizably the same species. But now the honest differences, because they matter enormously, and ignoring them would be exactly the kind of lazy analysis this channel exists to avoid. First, the world economy of 2026 is far more interconnected than that of 1930, which cuts in two directions. On one hand, retaliation can spread faster and hit deeper because supply chains cross borders dozens of times. On the other hand, that same interconnection gives every government powerful reasons to negotiate rather than let a full spiral run, because the damage would rebound onto their own economies immediately and visibly. Second, in 1930, there was no mechanism to stop the spiral. Each country acted alone. Today, there are trade agreements, international institutions, and constant high-level negotiation. Several of the 2025 and 2026 tariff confrontations were followed by negotiated deals rather than pure escalation. The spiral has been interrupted repeatedly by deal-making, something that barely existed in 1930. Third, and most importantly, the monetary catastrophe that turned the 1930 downturn into the Great Depression, the banking collapses, the money supply contraction, is not the situation today. Central banks learned specific lessons from the 1930s and have acted across multiple crises precisely to avoid repeating them. This is a genuine and enormous difference. So I am not telling you that 2026 is 1930. It is not. Anyone who tells you a modern tariff policy will simply reproduce the Great Depression is overselling the parallel, and you should be skeptical of them. What I'm telling you is something more careful and I think more useful. The retaliation mechanism, the specific way that reasonable, defensible, protective decisions by individual countries can combine into shrinking global trade. That mechanism is real, it is timeless, and it is active right now. History does not tell us the outcome will be the same, but it tells us exactly what to watch for. And here is what to watch for, drawn directly from the 1930 sequence. Watch whether retaliation escalates or gets resolved through negotiation. In 1930, it escalated because there was no framework to stop it. Today, the key question is whether the constant deal-making keeps interrupting the spiral, or whether at some point the deals stop coming and the retaliation feeds on itself. That is the single most important variable. Watch the export side, not just the import side. The seductive thing about tariffs is that the benefit is visible and immediate. A protected factory, a saved job, a domestic industry that breathes easier. The cost is diffuse and delayed. The export markets that quietly shrink. The retaliation that hits a different industry in a different state. The foreign customers who slowly find other suppliers. In 1930, the visible benefit came first and the invisible cost came later. The political temptation is always to focus on what you can see. There is a famous idea in economics going back to the 19th century French writer Frédéric Bastiat about the seen and the unseen. The protected factory is seen, you can photograph it, visit it, count the jobs. The factory that was never built because an export market vanished is unseen. It exists only as an absence, a thing that quietly failed to happen. Bastiat's insight was that bad economic policy consistently favors the seen over the unseen, because the seen wins elections and the unseen has no constituency. The steel worker whose job is saved by a tariff knows exactly who to thank. The auto worker whose job is lost when steel becomes more expensive or when a trading partner retaliates against cars often never even knows why. This asymmetry, visible benefit, invisible cost, is the political engine that keeps the tariff mechanism alive across centuries, regardless of which party or which country is operating it. And this is precisely why the lesson of 1930 is so hard to learn. The damage from Smoot-Hawley was real, but it was spread thin across the entire economy and delayed by years, while the protection it offered was concentrated and immediate. By the time the full cost became undeniable, the connection back to the original decision had blurred. The mechanism hides its own consequences. That is what makes it dangerous, and that is what makes understanding it in advance so valuable. Watch the uncertainty itself. Even tariffs that are never fully implemented, even ones that are announced and then struck down or negotiated away, impose a cost, and because businesses cannot plan, cannot commit to investments, cannot know what the rules will be next year. Several economic analyses of the current period point to this uncertainty as a real drag on investment, independent of the tariff's direct effects. Now let me give the strongest version of the other side, because a fair analysis demands it. Supporters of an aggressive tariff policy make arguments that deserve to be heard clearly. They argue that decades of free trade genuinely hollowed out American manufacturing and devastated specific communities, and that this is real, measurable pain that free trade advocates spent years dismissing. They argue that some trading partners genuinely do engage in unfair practices, subsidies, currency manipulation, intellectual property theft, and that doing nothing has its own severe costs. They argue that tariffs are leverage, a tool to force better deals, and that the willingness to endure short-term disruption can produce long-term gains. And they point out correctly that predictions of immediate catastrophe from tariffs have sometimes been overstated by their opponents. These are serious arguments made by serious people, and the historical record does not simply dismiss them. Smoot-Hawley emerged from real agricultural suffering. The critics of free trade are pointing at real wounds. The question was never whether the pain that motivates tariffs is real. It is real. The question is whether this particular tool addresses that pain, or whether, through the retaliation mechanism, it risks deepening it. That is the genuine debate. Not good people versus bad people. Real competing analyses of a real problem with enormous stakes on every side. Here is where I will leave the history. The 1,028 economists who begged Hoover to veto Smoot-Hawley were not certain of catastrophe. They were warning about a mechanism, the retaliation spiral, that they understood well. Hoover signed anyway for reasons that were politically understandable, responding to real pressure from real people in real pain. The mechanism then did what mechanisms do. It did not care about intentions. It did not care that the goal was to help farmers. It followed its own logic: retaliation, counter-retaliation, shrinking trade, and the people it hurt most included the very farmers it was meant to protect. Whether today's very different world, with its central banks, and trade frameworks and constant negotiation can contain that same mechanism is genuinely unknown. It is being tested in real time in the legal battles, the negotiations, and the retaliations unfolding right now. I am not going to pretend I know the ending. Nobody does. What I know is that the mechanism is real, it is old, and it is worth understanding so that whatever happens next, you can see it clearly for what it is, rather than only through the lens of whoever is trying to sell you a simple story about it. Because that is really what all of this comes down to. Everyone with a political stake in the current trade conflict wants to sell you a simple story. One side wants you to believe tariffs are a magic tool that only punishes foreigners and brings jobs roaring home with no cost. The other side wants you to believe tariffs are pure economic self-sabotage with no legitimate purpose at all. Both simple stories are wrong, and both are wrong in the same way. They erase the mechanism. The truth is that tariffs grow from real pain, are imposed with understandable intentions, offer real and visible benefits to specific industries, and simultaneously set in motion a retaliation dynamic whose costs are real, diffuse, delayed, and easy to ignore until they compound. Holding both of those truths at once is harder than picking a side, but it is the only way to actually see what is happening. The 1,028 economists were not partisans. They were people who understood a mechanism and tried to warn about it. Whether the mechanism is contained this time by all the modern safeguards that did not exist in 1930 is the question that is being answered right now in real time in front of all of us. Subscribe if you want to keep following this, because I'll be tracking exactly how the current trade conflict unfolds against the lessons of 1930 as the legal cases and negotiations develop. And I want your genuine argument in the comments. Given the real differences between 1930 and today, the central banks, the trade frameworks, the constant deal-making, do you think the retaliation mechanism gets contained this time, or are those safeguards weaker than they look? Make the strongest case you can from either direction. I'll read them. The most thoughtful argument gets pinned.